Okay, can everyone hear me? It's fine? We shouldn't waste any time because you never have enough time anyway. Colm, welcome to Jaipur.
Thank you very much, thank you.
It's your first JLF.
No, I've been here before. This is my first time at the festival.
Oh, well, welcome to all of you to a discussion which I think I will, for my part, you can ask questions later, I will focus on how one of the most fully imagined characters of 21st century fiction was devised, and he's no less wonderful for also having been a real person in the 19th century, which is the novelist Henry James. And you took up the theme of some years of his life in The Master. So I just wanted at the beginning to discuss the construction of that book with you because it's such a complex subject. And first of all, Colm, do you think if there'd been an audience like this on that night when Henry James's first play opened for the first time, maybe he would have gone off in a different line and not written all those novels because that was so disappointing and there were so few people that destroyed his theatrical career, didn't it?
I think it's really important to remember just how different things were then. We have no recordings of Henry James's voice. We have some photographs of him, but he never in general appeared in public. Towards the end of his life in the United States, he began to give some lectures. But at the time this book is set, he really had never appeared in public. When he finished a book, he sent it to his publishers, and the following day, he began another book. You know, it wasn't as though he went on a book tour, or he went to any festivals, and he never gave any readings from his work, so he had no sense of what his work sounded like. But what he really wanted, in the same way almost as a writer today might want a success in Hollywood or Bollywood, what he wanted was a success in the theater. He had his eye on Oscar Wilde, and Oscar Wilde, at the time we're talking about, had one successful play on in London, which could bring in a great amount of money and a great amount of the sort of fame that a novelist could not really win since the time of Charles Dickens, who of course did do huge numbers of public events. So Henry James wrote a really dreadful play. It could not have been worse. It was about something that no one in England had any interest in. It was about a Catholic family who had only one child, a son, and the issue was, the drama was, would the son become a priest or a monk, or would the son inherit the, inherit the money? And nobody cared about this. So the priest in question, or the young man in question, is called Guy Darnville. And at one moment during the opening night of the play, when he says, "I'm the last of the Darnvilles," in a very dramatic voice, someone from the back shouted, "It's a bloody good thing you are." And the entire audience began to laugh. Henry James, that evening, he couldn't think what to do. So much depended on this night. He even at one moment was going to sit in a local pub. The idea of Henry James in a pub is sort of astonishing, and wait and have someone come to tell him all the time how it was going. But he made a really bad decision. He went to An Ideal Husband, the play by Oscar Wilde that was running with such success. The audience loved that play. They laughed at every joke. The worse the joke was, in James's opinion, the more the audience laughed. James sat there stony-faced. He didn't think a single thing was funny. All he was thinking about was his own play. So when that play was over, he walked across St. James, he walked over to St. James's Theatre where his play was, and the doorman nodded to him to suggest things were going well. He misunderstood the sound. He thought it was applause. What was happening was the audience, his friends, were applauding, but everybody else, people who paid for their seats, were catcalling, yelling, and shouting abuse. And so angry was the manager, who was also the main actor, at Henry James for having written this play, that he enticed him onto the stage. And you can just imagine Henry James, he had never appeared in public in his life before, and he looked at this audience, and he decided, he made another mistake, to bow. And when he bowed, he looked up again, angry, shouting calls of abuse at him. And so that was a disaster for him in the theater. But what's interesting is the next day he writes a letter. And, he's now in his 50s. He's 54 years old. And he says, now, this is the time when I will write my best work. It is as though the shock he got and the sense of what public failure looked like made him realize that his job would be to go indoors, to actually stay away from light and crowd, and move into shadow, and move into imaginary spaces, and that now he would do his best work. The problem, of course, is, this is 1895, so he's 52. The problem, of course, is that for the next 5 or 6 years, he really only writes one successful story, which is The Turn of the Screw. What he's doing is he's, as Samuel Beckett said, he's failing and failing better, building up to the great flowering of the novel in English in the early 20th century. In 1 year each, he wrote The Ambassadors, The Wings of the Dove, and The Golden Bowl. 1 year each, living alone in a house in Rye. And so in my novel is set in these 5 years of failure. But it's an odd failure. A failure for a novelist is strange because you never know what's coming. You never know what some image might lead to, or a rhythm that an image has led to might in turn lead to. And so James, what he's doing in these 5 years is almost collecting the images that will make up these 3 great novels, which will be not only the flowering of his career as a novelist, but the flowering of the novel form itself.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that detail about how he walks into the theater and the doorman nods and he misunderstands completely, because as we see in the book, what he really prides himself on is the delicacy of his understanding of human behavior and of the human face, actually. For a lot of times in the book, we see people watching one another, and of all the characters in the social world that James inhabits, he is the most reticent and the most proudly so. Like, he likes to be able to understand people without giving anything away of himself, isn't it?
Yes, I think that James understood that to be a novelist is to be a noticer. He used the phrase himself that a novelist is someone on whom nothing is lost. And he was particularly good at that moment of recognition, where somebody sees somebody else in a position, and from what they see in that glimpse, that gaze, that moment, something is understood that was not understood before. For example, in his novel Portrait of a Lady, towards the end of the book, he has his heroine, Isabel Archer, come into a room. And in the room, her husband and her husband's friend, Madame Merle, are in the room. But Madame Merle is standing up at the mantelpiece, and the husband is sitting down, relaxed. The minute she sees them in that position, she realizes that there's a familiarity between them that she didn't know before. She catches them in a second. They don't speak. No one tells her anything, just in that moment of looking. So that idea for James of the glimpse, the glance, the gaze, and then arising from that, the idea of pure recognition, I think that mattered enormously. And again, that's something that you can capture in a paragraph, because, of course, prose fiction does something in a way that theatre cannot do, and cinema cannot do, and poetry cannot do, and which is that you can tell the reader what is happening in somebody's mind, and then you can tell the reader what the person says, and the reader can see the distance often between what someone is thinking and what someone is saying, or indeed what someone is thinking and what the reader slowly understands someone is feeling. That those levels, those layers of feeling, understanding, thinking, and noticing can be registered in a novel in a way that they cannot really be fully registered in any art form. In a way they can be suggested in a portrait, but they cannot be fully dramatized, I think, in any form except in the form of prose fiction, either the novel or the story. And this idea of recognition was something absolutely fundamental for the way that James turned his novels.
That's very beautifully put. So if, as you say, this is what is unique to fiction, it follows then that inside the world of the novel, the narrator has an uncommon power to interpret the characters in the book. And often that can be a dangerous power, and in some novels, I don't know, you find you have the same reaction. You feel that the narrator sort of overstepping his privileges and trying to tell us everything about everybody, and there's some sort of median position of sort of like of withheld knowledge from which you try and interpret the world from a single point of view, and that is the pleasure of fiction, to give away some details and to hold some others back, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can make any rules about this. You know, in other words, I think fiction contains many mansions. In other words, I think it's probably still possible to write a novel in which you tell the reader what they must think about a certain character, and in which you could certainly do that in the 19th century. I think you could probably still try to do it. James was appalled at that idea. And he was appalled also at the idea, which would come up a lot, for example, in George Eliot, that she would offer her political opinions about progress or about the nature of England in the middle of a novel. And he wanted to refine this system, which we might call third-person intimate, that while there is a narrator, that the narrator is absent from the book, that the narrator somehow or other has become invisible, and everything is seen through the eyes of one protagonist. I mean, there are variations on this, for example, in Portrait of a Lady, but actually in the main, in Portrait of a Lady, you see everything from Isabel Archer's point of view. In the same way as in the novel The Ambassadors, you see everything from Lambert Strater's point of view. In other words, one character gets to see, notice, and register what's going on. And I think the theory of this is that after maybe 30 pages, the reader starts to become that person, to live within that person, and to begin to see the world of the novel through the eyes of a single protagonist. So, for example, it's not about using voice. There's no first-person singular. It's merely about using third person, like he or she. But within that he or she, slowly, the theory of this would be that that person becomes very close to the reader, that the reader has begun to notice the world, experience the world through that person's consciousness, and not through their voice, but through their consciousness, and that therefore the reader slowly gradually becomes very close to that person. So that's the theory of that. It's something we're all still trying to refine and work with.
And that's one of the pleasures of the method, isn't it? There's still so much left in it, of the possibilities are immense.
Well, yes, he refined it, and we can all still work with it. And in the novel I wrote about him, I do that too. In other words, every single thing that is noticed, that is felt or seen, is seen, noticed, or felt by Henry James. There is no me in the novel. I mean, I think the best way of describing this is that the page, or indeed the screen, I wrote the book in longhand, so it was a page, that the page is blank. It is not a mirror. There's no self working. You are invisible to yourself. You are merely the words putting down, which you're giving to, and you're giving ways of noticing, as I say, feeling, remembering, and seeing to another person.
Yes, I think the pleasure of the master was that a lot of readers of James already have a view of the Jameson view of life, but to have that then turn back and to get a Jameson view of James made it sort of a doubly concentrated experience, and that must have been one of the pleasures of writing it, and a kind of challenge as well, because you have to, everything has to, it's almost like you're being scrutinized by the master yourself, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, what happened was that that I had read all of James's work, and I had noticed this absence. And what I had presumed was that Henry James, who was born in 1843 and died in 1916, had a seriously uneventful life. He was born, he grew old, he grew fat, he grew bald, and then he died. And obviously he moved from England to America, or America to England, and he lived most of his life in England. But I felt there was no life there, that the sensibility had been in a way transferred to the imagination, that he had not actually lived. And he has a number of stories, especially towards the end of his life, where he talks about the idea of a man who has never actually lived his life properly, that somehow that has subsumed sensibility, and not had the experiences he might have had. And particularly in a late story called The Beast in the Jungle, where he actually explores the drama surrounding that. Now, what happened next is that as a thing developed, especially in the United States, a thing called queer theory, where a number of very serious and talented critics began to look at James and began to study the relationship between Henry James's supposed, and I think a pretty clear, homosexuality, with the way in which this idea of secrecy in his books, of glimpsing, glancing, and recognition in his books, of fear of exposure in his books, and began to elaborate a theory that somehow or other the books arose from his being in the closet, and that they operated from a sort of neurosis in a way, that the way in which his characters are themselves in a way so repressed, the way in which his own prose style often refuses to name the very thing it's attempting to describe, and then often does so in a sort of side sentence, that he's always playing with ideas of what's clear and what's to be concealed, and concealment interests all his characters, so that this work done in the United States began to interest me. And I thought, in order to write about this idea of James now that was changing, I would have to find out about this life of his that I thought had not really happened, that he had not had a life. I was also writing a book of my own, and I thought, surely the most boring 4 books in the world must be the 4-volume biography of Henry James. I mean, there could not be more boring books. I'm talking 2,000 pages of pure boredom. I mean, compare that with, say, the life of Napoleon, for example. You think, oh, the life of Napoleon, filled with exile, battles, Russia, love affairs. Henry James, nothing. He wrote another story. So, I mean, how could you write this book? Why does it have 4 volumes? So I started to read the book, and of course the book is fascinating. And of course, it's always a mistake to think that nobody had a life. Of course he had a life. And the life is so filled with ambiguity. In other words, he loved his family. And the first thing he did was he got away from them as quickly as he could, and he stayed away from them. He wrote his mother really affectionate letters saying how much he missed her and loved her, but he wasn't going back to America. He wrote his brother, he wrote his sister eventually. In order to find him, she had to come and live in England. So that was the first thing. The second thing was he really wanted to be alone at night. He loved reading, he loved writing, but he went out every night. And he deplored going out every night. And he accepted invitations and more invitations. And so he dined out. This is one of the reasons he grew fat. He dined out every night. And he wanted to be alone every night. Nothing is settled in him. And he was homosexual. And his closest relationships were with women. And he was rich. His grandfather had been the second richest man in New York State after Mr. Astor. And he was obsessed with the idea that he was poor. There's no end to the number of ambiguities and conflicts going on within his personality. And of course, in 4 volumes, you can really get this idea of constantly, where he also, of course, didn't believe that a novelist should explore himself or expose himself in a novel. But nonetheless, there's another ambiguity there. The more you know about his life, the more you can see areas of his life that are actually disclosed and dramatized in the books. So this idea began to interest me, this idea of a figure filled with ambiguities. So I began to write the novel. I began to see him almost as a character in a novel. I think there were enough biographies of him. I also want to say one more thing about this, that in the years after his death, he died in 1916, his family were really concerned that people would find out about his homosexuality. And unfortunately, in the last years of his life, beginning in his 50s, it's a lesson to all of us, he wrote letters. And the letters They're not explicitly homosexual, but they're very, very close. He's always writing to young men saying, I long to hold you, to be with you, to have you in my arms. And you know, it couldn't be serious. And of course, what his family did was they made sure that these letters did not see the light of day. These letters were not published. You know, his letters to particularly a very handsome young Norwegian sculptor living in Rome, Heinrich Andersen. His letters to Heinrich Andersen did not appear until the 1990s, even though Andersen asked the family in 1930 if he could publish a volume of them, and the family said no. So in other words, in the 1990s, we began to find out much more about Henry James as the James family released control over the estate, but also as the family realized, as things began to change in America, that the fact that he was homosexual would make him more interesting now, which might not have been the case in the 1920s and 30s, when really people were afraid of homosexuals and thought there was something dreadfully wrong about homosexuality. That suddenly homosexuality, which is the strangest thing that's happened in my lifetime, became fashionable. I mean, it was unfashionable not to be. And so that James studies moved, you know, James studies actually became an aspect of queer studies or of the study, you know, people were tired of white, heterosexual European men. And suddenly James moved out of that boring space into another space where he could be studied in a different way. So I didn't feel that a book of essays would help, because I wasn't sure I could contribute much to that. Or a new biography certainly wasn't needed, because two more had appeared. What I wanted to do was use the form that I know best, which is the form of the novel.
One of the pleasures of the master is that you see that you have entered this very rarefied social world where the same people who've known each other, the old world, old families from across America and England, and occasionally they let someone new into their world. They keep meeting at these dinners and just talking about life, about who they met, and it's a very, very small, intimate world. And the pleasures of that is being schooled in how the characters all look at one another and make up the gap in meaning between what these people are saying and what they said somewhere else, or what they are imagined to be thinking. And then you see in these characters is one writer, which is Henry James, and so his noticing is not just a social one, but also an artistic one. He's using all of this material. And then discreetly you begin to see at certain times that the watching is also an erotic one, that sometimes this figure comes up, there's nothing explained. Henry, although we have access to his mind, he never lets on. We never see him thinking, this is a sexy man, or here's someone I'd like to go to bed with. And yet there's some tension in that dialogue, and that's that was really carefully and cleverly constructed.
Yes, I mean, I thought that one of the great battles that's been fought, and was fought maybe in the early years of the 20th century, and indeed later on by figures such as James Joyce, and later on by Nabokov, Henry Miller, for example, there was the right to write explicitly about sex in a novel and to have that published freely and disseminated without any issue. I should say the country I come from, Ireland, took particular exception to this idea of freedom until the 1960s, and there was a savage censorship. Even if you mentioned the word, you know, any word to do with sex, the book was banned until the mid-1960s. When I came to the idea of writing about Henry James, especially writing about his private life, his life alone, his imaginative life, I found the idea of not writing about sex more powerful than sex itself. For example, I found when Heinrich Andersen, who I mentioned earlier, who's a very beautiful American-Norwegian sculptor, he comes to stay with Henry James. So here I have it. The wonderful moment is available to me now. There's no evidence for this, but no novelist has ever been bothered about evidence. So you simply say, this is the moment now where Henry James is going to have sex like no sex was ever had. I'm going to do it page after page after page, describing all the things they did and didn't do with each other through the night. And then I realized that that's already been done. And it's also, I'm not sure it will fit into the tone of the novel. So what I have instead is Henry James is alone in one bedroom. in this house with floorboards upstairs. He's alone in the bed. And in the bedroom across the corridor, he knows Heinrich Andersen is undressing. And he's imagining him taking off his clothes one by one. And then he hears a shoe drop. And he realizes that imagining Heinrich Andersen undressing is almost more powerful for James than seeing him undress or being in the room with him undress. And I found that if the reader thinks that I'm going to describe this long night of sex, no sex, unsex, lack of sex, oddly enough, can have, now that we have the freedom to describe sex, a more powerful effect in a book, the withholding of that particular drama in a book. So yes, there's a constant sense of James erotically watching, erotically wanting, thinking erotically. But the next page you turn and you find he's writing a new story.
Very fine. Yeah, I remember the time when, exactly at this passage where you describe, you see Henry saying, acknowledging to himself the impossibility of his imaginings, and that's where you leave it. And I think that mix of, it's so paradoxical that the smallest situations of meeting somebody that inspires like large pages and pages of rumination on what they might have said, what they might have meant, and yet these big areas of human feeling are all like narrowed down to like small filaments.
Yes, I mean, I think everyone who writes a novel knows this, that often a novel, an entire novel, can come from something very small that someone told you. For example, when I was 12, my father died, and people began to visit the house every evening. I was just casually listening to the conversations, and one evening a woman came, and she talked about her daughter who was in Brooklyn. She didn't say America, she didn't say Manhattan, New York. She said Brooklyn. It was all about Brooklyn. I just began to watch her and listen to her. And often the most interesting conversations were, I'm sure it's not like this in India, but it's true in Ireland, when the person had left the room. The conversations were often more interesting because people would talk about the person who had left immediately. And somebody said, do you know about that woman's daughter who went to Brooklyn? And of course, I immediately start listening. And they say, you know, before she came back from Brooklyn, the guy she was going out with in Brooklyn was so crazy about her that he said, if you go to Ireland, you'll never come back. She said, no, I will. No, marry me then, marry me. And she married him, but on the boat she took off the ring because she didn't want to tell her parents, because they would know that she would always live in America, that she was never going to come back to Ireland, you know, and that she was just back for a visit. But all I had was just 5 sentences of what I remembered when I was 12 about a woman. And from those 5 sentences, I got the novel Brooklyn. And from nothing else. That from the strangest beginnings, something comes. And I think James was really alert to that. He had a friend, who, for example, who wrote a novel, and it was a novel much admired at the time, about French Protestant youth. I can't imagine what such a novel would be like, but it was about French Protestant youth. And someone said, how did you do the research? How did you know so much about French Protestant youth? And she said, oh, one day I was going down the stairs and I looked in a door and there were some French Protestant youth in the room. And I saw them for 1 second. And that was enough, just seeing them, to get all of the novel. So James knew, and you know, it's very interesting to see this because James kept notebooks. And soon after he had the disaster in the theater that I described at the beginning, he went and had supper. He was very good at having supper. He went and had supper with the Archbishop of Canterbury. You can see in his notebooks, it's January 1895, supper with the Archbishop. An interesting story. And what James loved was half a story. He hated it if anyone told him an entire story, because of course the entire story then was finished, and because he loved something that his imagination could work on. So the Archbishop told him about 2 children who had been kept in a country house away from the world, that their parents were dead, but their guardian was in London. and a governess was told to look after these children, but do not contact anyone in London. Simply, you have full responsibility for these 2 children. He notes that as 4 sentences in January 1895, and then you see, 2 years later, in 1897, he begins to write the famous story, The Turn of the Screw. But one more thing happens before he writes it, which is that he himself buys or gets a long lease on his first house, which is Lamb House in Rye. And in the months between signing the lease and moving into the house, James himself begins to imagine what it will be like to move into a strange old dark house, but new for him. And whatever disturbance is happening in his mind makes its way to find that story the Archbishop had told him, the idea of space as old, dark, haunted, and frightening, and a person going to that space for the first time, that he merged something happening in his own life with half a story he'd been told. And from that, he got the most powerful, I think, short story he wrote, which is The Turn of the Screw.
Yes, many times in the book, we see how Henry goes about making his stories and how he puts things together. And I found it interesting, one, as you say, that he likes these stories half-told, and when he sees a story in his mind, often on the basis of what somebody else has said, it's never a portrait of a character. It's as if there's a character in a situation that comes at the same time, and he sees he sees them in sort of dynamic tension rather than something very flat. And that sense of a situation then allows him to explore both the character and a wider story.
Yes, I think he said the 3 greatest things you can say to anyone writing a novel. So if anyone here is writing a novel, or if you know anyone writing a novel, just say this to them regularly. Dramatize, dramatize, dramatize. And, I think what's interesting about that is that he allowed certain things to haunt him. For example, he had a cousin called Minnie Temple, and she was an orphan, and Henry James and his siblings loved the Temple family because they were orphans, and they thought being an orphan was so glamorous, and their cousins were always with them. But Minnie was particularly shining, shimmering figure. She loved talking. She loved reading George Eliot. She had an inquiring mind. James was fascinated by her. Men were fascinated by her. James's brother, William, was fascinated by her. Oliver Wendell Holmes was fascinated by her. She had a sparkling and brilliant intelligence. And then she began to die of consumption. And James is in England when she dies. And we can see now the letters he begins to write. Because, of course, James was always writing letters saying, burn this letter. And it's like, delete this email. And people simply, it meant all the more reason why people kept the letters. So we can see these letters he wrote in the aftermath of her death. And in the aftermath of her death, he began to imagine her. He began to see her more clearly. And when he began to publish Portrait of a Lady in extracts, a friend from Boston wrote to him to saying, I see you're writing a novel about your cousin Minnie Temple. James immediately realized a problem was coming his way. He said, no, this is not a novel based on life. No novel is based on life. Life is thin. The purpose of the novel is to complete life, or to add density, or add texture to life. So it is not based on life. It is a way of completing life. And what he did then was he began to imagine his cousin as though she had not died. And he puts her into, it's very interesting where he puts her at the opening of the book, into the exact house that Henry James's grandmother and Minnie Temple's grandmother had owned in Albany in upstate New York. He has her there, and she's discovered, as it were, by her aunt and brought to Europe. And Minnie Temple really wanted to see England, and she wanted to see a grand house in England. And of course she wanted to see Florence, and she wanted to see Rome. And James brought her ghost by giving her ghost body, by making her ghost fully present in the book. He got her spirit, and he recreated her spirit in the form of sentences. And therefore he gave her a drama in her life. He brought her first to England and then to Italy. And then there's an interesting moment in the letters where he writes to his brother saying, it would have been impossible to imagine who she might have married. And of course, then he realizes, and he, as he writes in the preface later, what do you do with a heroine in the novel in the 19th century? Why, she must marry. And of course, then James sets about, almost as though it's a folk tale, where the young, beautiful princess coming from America has to inherit money. Now she's a rich girl. Then you must have 3 suitors, as you do in the folk tale. First came the lord, then came the insistent American, and then came the one whom she fatally misunderstood, whom the reader sees as dark, but she does not see as dark. She sees as some sort of enabling figure. So that he combined elements of the folk tale, but also with something that really mattered to him, which was the death of his cousin, was the first serious death that had mattered to him. And he began to sort of mourn her in a way by recreating her, by creating a great novel, not in her memory or by using her life, but by giving her a sort of life that life could never have given her, even had she lived.
Well, I have so many other questions, but I'm sure others want to ask, so I'm going to ask one last one. As far as I could tell, I could find only one exclamation mark in the entire text. Was it exciting putting that bit of punctuation?
I have it in for a few things. I often wonder about adjectives, that you often, well, the first thing is, I think, certainly for me, describing a character, I mean describing a face. For example, in, I think, the most recent novel I published, Nora Webster, you have no idea whether she's tall or small, what color her hair is or her eyes. You just begin to see, you begin to see the effect she's having on the world. So that, I think a great deal of writing is about withholding. That often you're withholding information, which will come later. Often you're withholding emotion, so the reader can all the better imagine emotion, or put their own sense of emotion onto what's happening in the book. But adjectives sometimes don't help. If you over-describe a person, if you over-describe a scene, and the same goes for adverbs, that often it's more judicious in a way to hold back on that as a way of allowing the reader more space to imagine. And finally, to answer your question, the exclamation mark, I have it in for the exclamation mark. I really think it's something we don't need at all. And if it's in the book once, I'm sorry. And if they're doing a new edition, I will have it removed forthwith.
No, Colm, you can't take it out actually, because it's the one place where Henry says something that he doesn't mean to, he's agitated, and so he shouts out.
Oh, it's in dialogue?
Yeah.
Oh, in dialogue
That's
it's
allowed.
sort of different, because sometimes you do need, without using an adverb, to let the reader know that something powerful now, for once, is being said, and then you can retreat back into the shadows, into quietness.
Yeah, actually, I felt at that moment that you feel like, this is Henry really agitated because this is not how he speaks, so that was perfectly...
Once. You could do it once then, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
No, we